People are also buying things like these, space heaters, telephones, for example, waffle irons. That was a pretty popular one. That makes me really hungry right now. Okay, so just different stuff that you can plug into a wall. All these are examples of that. And so again, buying on credit. And one of the things we saw in the video too is that marketing is being, there's tons of advertising being sent all the time out to the consumers to try to get them to buy stuff. Just similar to what we have today. But that really takes off in the 20s. All right, culture of the Roaring 20s. We have a number of things here that beg to be highlighted. First of all, the radio, of course, is the one thing that people just can't live without. I knew you were going to say the iPhone, but no. It's really hard for us to understand in our day and age that people really looked at the radio as entertainment. The whole idea and what a radio did is it made it so that you could sit around and be a community and just listen to stuff. Now, I don't know if you've ever done that on radio. Normally we just watch TV, right? As a family or whatever it might be. To sit around, I can't tell you how cool it was to have that big radio in the center of your living room and just to hang out and chill with your family and be like, oh, cool. Let's turn it into our favorite show, And there were radio dramas, and they were kind of kooky by our standards, stuff like The Shadow, which was a story about kind of like a superhero who went on exploits. Oftentimes, those would be kind of like the main things that people would want to do when they listen to radio. Silent films, and this is a fairly scary picture of Charlie Chaplin. I mean, man, he just looks really it's scary. But anyways, we have the movies and the birth of Hollywood. Now the picture you see, I'm gonna click on all this stuff. Sorry. The picture you see in the bottom right-hand corner is the actual first talking film. It's called The Jazz Singer, and it stars this guy named Al Jolson, who it's kind of interesting. I think stars back in the day had to really be either pale or look halfway insane to basically get people's attention. But movies were a lot different than they were back in the day than they are today. But still, average price of a movie back perhaps in the 1920s and 1930s to see like at least 4 hours or maybe even 6 hours of film, 15 cents, which is a lot of, well, it's not a lot of money, but it's certainly less than what we pay. I mean, that's why I don't go see movies anymore. Partly because I'm married and have kids, but also they're expensive, right? This would be like the Taylor Swift of the day, like the female heartthrob, Mary Pickford. You can kind of tell the 1920s style, the 1920s culture. I'm not a woman's fashion guy, okay? But you can definitely see the 20s influence on her. She has like very short hair, very pale. The makeup is how it's supposed to kind of make her look a little bit more, I don't even know what the word is, but you see what I'm talking about. So culture revolves around radio, it revolves around movies, it revolves around entertainment, it revolves around also just celebrities, sports heroes, people like Babe Ruth, people like Ty Cobb, people that represent something greater than what people actually are, or what they, and maybe these people represent things that people want to be. And that's kind of what's going on here, especially with radio, because with radio it makes these celebrities look bigger and look more important and be something that people want to aspire to be. Kind of like on the movie Superman. You ever see that one? Okay, never mind. Well, anyways. Superman's father says, "You must give the human race something to aspire to." I'm like thinking, okay, I can use that in my 1920s lecture. All right. Or not. I try all kinds of stuff. Baseball was probably the major sport back in the day, although with radio comes a huge, larger devotion to sports and sporting events. Jack Dempsey was a very popular boxer of the time, for example. Also just people that do extraordinary things, like Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean nonstop. What's that?
Lucky Lindy?
Lucky Lindy, that's him right there, yes. And being that aviation was kind of a new frontier in a lot of ways, something that hadn't necessarily been tried or done in that way. You know, all of this kind of hero worship kind of stuff begins in the 1920s. These guys become larger than life. Of course, Babe Ruth is probably, out of all these celebrities, probably the guy who you think of. And this is pre-steroids baseball. You know, he's hitting 60 home runs in 1927 with Lou Gehrig too. And the Yankees are like, you know, in America's prime city, the #1 ticket, I guess you could say. Also, in terms of jazz and culture and everything, let's talk about the ladies a little bit. As you saw in the video, because of the 19th Amendment, there is a huge emphasis on women breaking boundaries of what's expected of them and what they can do. And they're starting to change the way they look, they're starting to change the way they act, and they're starting to become more and more and more and more independent, which is to the shock of many traditionalists back in the day. You know, the whole idea that women are wearing skirts that you can see their leg or their ankle or their foot even, or what, like, just whoa, flesh everywhere. It's like it was probably, for a lot of folks back in the day, kind of a real shock to the senses, which sounds comical to us, because I mean, you look around and it's like, whoa, it's become pretty commonplace. I mean, witness Beyonce at the Super Bowl a few years ago, or Madonna, or Janet Jackson, for crying out loud, you know, like a few years ago. It's like, wow. It's like in America, we're just inundated with that. And that's all I'm gonna say. Otherwise, it gets awkward. But yes, lots of big changes for women as a result of taking this further. Bless you. We've got flappers who dress up in this way. Flappers go a little bit past the normal, and then you have vamps who kind of really don't care. They'll just do whatever they want to do, and they don't care about getting caught or the consequences of it. And so, despite all this, did women achieve any kind of social and economic equality in the 1920s? What do you think? The answer is no. Did women begin to work in other industries? Yes. Did women start to exercise their newfound political rights? Yes. But did it mean that every single woman out there was taking advantage of all that? The answer is no. And the answer is also no, that did it help women achieve full economic and social equality? No. And you can make an argument that women still have not achieved full equality. That's why Obama signed an Equal Pay Act a few years ago. So, you know, although the odds are we could have a female president in 2016. Writers that you guys probably read in high school, you know, The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, these are these guys here, and you can see that basically these guys tried to capture the era of the 1920s, The Great Gatsby being about, you know, basically wealth and about, limitless possibilities and stuff. All of this is all tied together. A lot of the times the culture and the literature always mirrors each other. Now, musically speaking, one of the things that we see in the 1920s is the birth of jazz, which is basically an imported blues form, primarily done by African Americans from the South. And then when they come up north to settle during World War I, called the Great Migration, they bring up with them different musical forms. And jazz is the really hot, cool musical form. And it's not the first time African Americans are going to come up with something that's new and cool and hip. But it doesn't take long in the 1920s for jazz musicians to come up with these really slamming tunes, I guess you could say. And all of a sudden, people like George Gershwin come along that kind of steal or borrow that, and white musicians start to play this stuff. The same thing's going to happen like 30 years later, in 1951, when Little Richard comes out with some pretty heavy-duty stuff. And they didn't even know what to call the kind of music. They called it race music. It was actually, we call it rock and roll. And then white people started taking that and then you got Elvis to market to a whole new group of people. And then the 1970s and 1980s, you have hip hop, which starts out in the, depending on who you ask, probably in New York City. All of a sudden that blows up in the 1980s, and it becomes marketable to a white audience, and pretty soon you have Eminem, or Drake or something. I don't even know who these guys are. I'm just saying, there's a pattern in American history how African Americans come out with cool stuff. It's just dope stuff, and then everybody else just tries to capitalize on it. Record companies, magazines, whatever. It's just amazing to me. But nevertheless, Harlem is that town where this is going down. It's pretty cool. Now, about African Americans, I think we definitely need to talk about this, because this is a huge concept in the 1920s. And what you see on this map is what you call the Great Migration. It is a tremendous time of change. And one of the most important things to happen in the 20th century in terms of American culture and the economic and social makeup of our country. And that is simply that during the war years, World War I, you have a mass movement of black folks from the segregated South coming into pretty much anywhere else they can get to. It's primarily in the north, the northern cities, where kind of, you see in the yellow strand right there coming from the East Coast, you see that you're starting to have huge African American sections of cities, like up in the north, such as in New York, and a good example is Harlem. For example, up in Philadelphia, you're going to have a kind of an overwhelmingly African American section of Harlem. In Boston, South Boston is going to be primarily populated by African Americans. You can see in the purple strand there, they're going up to Cleveland, for example, to Detroit, places like Milwaukee. And the blue strand is the most interesting one for us in California, because you see that the Bay Area receives a huge amount of African Americans during the war years. And that is why Oakland today is very much has a huge African American population. So does Los Angeles, like in certain places, like in the south central sections of Los Angeles, like Watts, Compton, that kind of, in those places. And so you just have this massive change, and with it, African Americans bring their music, they bring their culture, they bring a lot of cool things to kind of change the social dynamics of the North. Now, don't think for a minute that the northern states were I'm not going to say that they weren't welcoming, but I'm not going to say that they weren't racist either. There was a lot of problems, as we'll look on in the next few minutes. And these are just some pictures of African Americans. Like the lady up in the upper right-hand corner, African Americans primarily came to work in the defense industries up in the north, where the manufacturing